We'll give everybody another minute or two to join us. Thank you all for being here. Excited to have you. All right. Well, if you are here for Planting for Success Part 2 tree series, you're in the right place. We have a really good presentation from Kamie Long again today. But before we jump into it and I pass it on to her, we have a few housekeeping things. So I wanted to again welcome you. Thank you so much for joining us today. Again, this is the tree series Part 2 out of 3, Planting for Success. My name is Chelsea, and I'm the Assistant Director of Alumni Engagement here at CSU, focusing on Colorado and Southern Wyoming. We're really excited to have you. Before we jump in, I just want to thank some of our alums and our Alumni Association members. Thank you so much for your membership. It makes a huge difference to our community and to the resources that we're able to provide just like this. So thank you all for being a part of the Alumni Association. I did want to do a few quick housekeeping, especially for YouTube Live if you haven't used it before. We will have some time for questions at the end, so feel free to put those in the comment sections. You can also do that by creating a YouTube account or utilizing your Gmail account and logging into YouTube that way. Or you can see my email on the screen and feel free to send me an email with your questions, and we will get those to Kamie for the end of this event. Now, again, this is the Part 2 series of 3, and so if you missed the first one, Branching Out, you are able to see that on the YouTube channel, and feel free to go in between all of the different tree series. You don't have to watch them in chronological order. It's really great information to benefit where you are in the tree process. And our next tree series, Part 3, will be July 16th, same time, 12:30 Mountain Time, and that is Pruning with a Purpose. So I wanted to be able to share some interesting tree facts that we have about CSU and on campus. So the oldest tree on campus is more than 135 years old, and it's located near the former location of Old Main. There are the first 2 rows of American elms on the CSU Oval were planted in 1881. And there was around 3,000 trees that were planted at that time, including 2 huckleberry trees that are near Spruce Hall, if you know where that is. And it's crazy because the 2 remaining trees are registered with the Colorado State Forestry Service as the 3rd and 4th largest huckleberry trees in the state, just right here with your alma mater. And then the last fact that I wanted to share about some of the trees on our CSU campus is that the Colorado State tree is the blue spruce, and there are approximately 680 of them planted across the 3 campuses in Fort Collins. So that is pretty cool. Lots of fun tree facts that we have on CSU. And if you can remember being on campus, or if you're in here now, we just have trees everywhere, and it's so gorgeous, especially this time of year to walk around the Oval and see all of those. I want to be able to introduce everybody to Kamie Long, who will be doing our presentation for us today. So throughout this tree series, Kamie, who is the Urban and Community Forestry Specialist for the Western Slopes, Kamie has been working for the Colorado State Forestry Service since she was out of college and works for the Grand Junction Field Office, where she gets to focus on her passion of working with communities and urban trees. Kamie has a lot of diversity in her role, including visiting with communities and landowners about a variety of tree issues, educating homeowners and master gardeners on the purpose of tree selection, planting, and pruning, just like some of us today, as we'll get to learn about that, and supporting communities with a variety of urban forestry issues. So Kamie, I'm going to pass it on to you. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks, Chelsea. Glad to be here. And just a small point, you said huckleberry trees, they're hackberry trees. Your verbiage was correct, but you said huckleberry, which, are you from the South then?
No, but that is a good correction. Thank you.
Hackberry trees are great trees, and very drought hardy, and they can become a lovely shade tree for folks. And diversity is such an important part. We talked about that on the part 1. When you're choosing your trees, diversity is super important. So we don't actually recommend planting alleys of trees of the same species anymore, just the same shape. So I'll get into planting for success. This is a really important thing to learn how to Okay, I think I'm here, right?
Yes, you are.
Sorry, I think my internet got a little confused there. So planting properly takes a little bit of time, and once you know how to do it, it's easy to do. It just takes time. So we're going to walk through the process of proper tree planting. So it's more than just digging a hole. This is a silver maple tree in a friend's house in Fort Collins area that they paid some good money to get planted. And when I went over to visit, I pulled back the mulch that was around the trunk and found multiple girdling roots. There's a girdling root here. And when we cut that out, there was another one below it. And then there's another girdling root here. So what we're gonna talk about today will be how to avoid, how to remove those girdling roots before you've planted the tree. So the agenda today is why it's important, how to find the root flare, how to remove circling roots, and then steps after planting, including fertilizing, mulching, staking, and watering. So I mentioned this really quickly at the end of the tree selection presentation, but I have documented all of these steps in a lovely fact sheet that is available to everyone. You can either use your phone and take a picture of the QR code, and it will take you to the website where this document is posted. You can also Google Colorado State Forest Service, plant a container tree, and this document will also come up. It's on there as a website, but you can also find it as a PDF document to download. And I'll share it with Chelsea, and she can have it as well if you reach out to her if you're struggling to get access to it. But all this information that I'm going to present is in this document, and so you can refer to it when you're got your tree and you're ready to start preparing to dig your hole. The first step, of course, is calling Colorado 811. Tree planting is considered excavation, and so we are required by state to have the property assessed to make sure that there's no buried utility lines. It's free. I've done it a few times because we're planting some trees at my office here at the Western Campus in Grand Junction. And so I went on to colorado811.org. You go to a map, you highlight the area of where you're going to be planting, and they will email you back any information. They'll email you back once the area has been assessed, and it's very easy to use and it's free. So make sure you contact Colorado 811 before digging any holes. So what I'm going to focus on is primarily container trees. So the trees that come in those plastic buckets, but there is bulb and burlap. There's some different steps when it comes to planting ball and burlap trees. So I'll go into that a little bit. A lot of these steps are very similar, but the ball and burlap trees have the burlap around it along with the twine and the metal cages. So there's a few different steps involved when planting B&B trees that we'll talk about. Container size, people always think they need to get the biggest tree possible, and that is a lot of times the ball and burlap trees. They're larger coming out of the field. But a rule of thumb is that the caliper, and we measure caliper as it's the bottom part of the tree. So diameter at breast height is how we measure to the size of the tree, and that's at 4.5 feet up on the tree. That's the diameter of the tree that we're measuring for, like the Champion Tree program, like Chelsea was saying, we're measuring the diameter of the tree at 4.5 feet. But when the tree is in a container, we're measuring its size based on caliper, which is just the measurement a couple inches above the root flare. And so when people talk about a 2-inch caliper tree, it's not at 4.5 feet, it's a couple inches above the root flare in the pot. And the rule of thumb is that for each inch in caliper is how long it will take the tree to establish in the landscape. So if you have a 2-inch caliper tree that you've purchased and you've planted, it will take around 2 years for the tree's root system to establish, and then it can start growing the canopy. So if you get a 3 or 4-inch caliper tree, so it's like instant landscape, it will take 3 or 4 years before that canopy starts to grow, because the tree has to get its root system established to be able to support and grow that canopy. So it's not always the best option to choose the biggest tree, because it will take so much longer for that tree to get established. So I like to buy the 1.5-inch to 2-inch caliper trees when I'm making recommendations, because it takes less time for that tree to establish in the landscape and start growing and contributing to the landscape that you've put it in. Most recommendations, most people I would say should kind of focus on this 15-gallon size, because it's easy to move. It's only 35 to 50 pounds versus these 25 gallons can get up to 100 pounds. And if you're trying to move it, into the backyard to plant that tree, it gets pretty heavy if you're getting above 15 gallons. And then with the caliper being 1.25 to 1.75, that's, less than 2 growing seasons before it's getting established and the root system is established and growing. So now it can start putting the energy into the canopy instead of the energy into growing those roots. So with planting, there's an epidemic of planting too deeply, and roots need oxygen. And so for some reason my photos didn't stack properly, but this is an image of a tree that's been planted too deeply. And this is the tree over a year later after it's planted. And you can see also that the burlap is here at the base of the tree. So that means that they didn't remove the burlap when they planted it. But a tree after 1 year, 1 growing season, should never move like that in the soil. So what happens is we plant too deeply, roots need oxygen. And so then the tree is stunted. It's having to try to move roots into the upper soil profile where it can get oxygen. It can cause tree death or setback. And it also increases the potential for these girdling or circling roots, the roots that are crossing in front of the trunk. And as the trunk and the roots grow, they're growing into each other. And we'll get more into that. So what happens a lot is that our trees are planted too deeply. But what I like to say is kids know better. They know how to draw a tree. When you can see I Googled kids drawing of a tree, and almost every image here has a root flare. There's a flare like a skirt on the bottom of every one of these trees. And what we plant are telephone poles because we're planting them too deep. The root flare, which the kids are drawing, is underground because we've planted too deeply. So we've got telephone poles into the ground versus our lovely trunk flare that the kids know. So what does that look like? This is what you want as a mature tree, where you have those nice flare out like a skirt. These are our scaffold or permanent root structures we're seeing. So when there's a windstorm, you can see that tree is really nicely anchored into the ground. Roots are actually located in the top 12 to 18 inches of soil. So underneath the little ram icon is the number 12. So tree roots are located in the top 1 to 1.5 feet of soil. That's not very deep. We always picture roots going like really deep, like they have these really deep tap roots. But like I said, roots need oxygen. There's not any oxygen deep in the soil. The oxygen is primarily in the top part where there's microbes and oxygen exchange and decay happening. That's where that oxygen is, and that's where the roots are. So we don't want to plant our tree too deeply, because then the roots are in a place where they can't get oxygen, and then they need it. So they're trying to then grow their roots up instead of out to hold that tree in the ground. So step 1 of planting a tree is you have to find the trunk flare, the root flare of the trunk. Most trees, both of these photos are trees that are in containers, and I can guarantee with a 99% accuracy that every tree that's in a container is too deep. The root flare is not at the soil surface in that container. You have to excavate. So there's just some examples of trees that are in containers that are too deep. So if you were at last month's presentation, we talked about trees that are grafted, and we talked about the graft points. So in this case, here is that graft point. And if you remember from the images that I shared, that graft point is a couple inches above that root flare. And so what happens is most people see this bulge and think that that's the root flare, and that's actually the graft point. And so you have to excavate down in order to find that root flare. So it takes time, and you do not want to be digging your hole for the tree until you find your root flare, because a lot of the times it's 3 inches deep. And I always say dig smarter, not harder. So if you're digging a hole that's deeper than it needs to be because your root ball is actually smaller once you excavate that root flare, then you've dug a hole that's too deep, and then you have to refill it. And then there's other issues where when you're refilling that hole, that soil can settle and then your root ball can sink after you've planted it. So you want your root ball to be on a hard surface, the bottom of your planting hole to be a solid surface that's not kind of filled with fluffy soil that you've had to put back in because you dug your hole too deep. We'll go into that as well. But in this case, the Parks and Wildlife had bought some trees for an Earth Day event, and I said, I can't be at the Earth Day event, but I will go and excavate your root flares on all of your container trees so that when your volunteers come, they're ready to go. So that's what these photos are from. So you can see here that we have the graft point, and then I'm starting to dig. So here's that graft point again, and I'm starting to dig. I'm using, which isn't maybe ideal, but it's what I always have with me. I usually tend to use my hand pruners, and I use the hook side of my hand pruners. So not the sharp side, this is the sharp side. So I use my hook side to kind of like slowly peel the soil away from my my trunk. And so I'm slowly peeling and pulling that soil away. And then what's happening is, you can see in this photo, is there's roots that I'm excavating, and see how they're really tiny and fine? Those are called adventitious roots. And they're called adventitious because they're taking advantage of soil being against the trunk. And so they're only growing because it's too deep in the pot, soil is against the trunk, and so the tree is activating these sleeping buds that should not be activated because there should never be soil against this part of the trunk. And so these are really fine. And so I'm just continuing to dig. I call these fake roots, fake outs. And so these photos are in that document, and you'll see, so you'll see this image on that, but all of these are fake outs. These are not the roots you're looking for. You're looking for the roots that's like coming off the trunk, that are, you know, part of the trunk, and it's flaring out. So in those trees that I was excavating for Parks and Wildlife, this is where the top of my finger on the top here, that's where the soil was when I started excavating. This is 2 to 3 inches down before I found roots that were sweeping off of the trunk. So you can tell that these are part of the trunk sweeping out. Here we have another view, the trunk sweeping out into these permanent scaffold roots. So that's what you're looking for, not this little fine hair, fake out, adventitious roots. And you can cut those off, or you can just leave them because they're going to desiccate and dry in the wind and the sun. If they're bigger, like these, where I'm finding these bigger roots as I excavate down, that's when I'm using my hand pruners as well, but now I'm cutting these off. So I'm cutting this off at the point of attachment on the trunk. When I'm finding roots that are crossing in front of the trunk, then that's that circling root that I've been talking about. I'll use circling and girdling kind of back and forth. They're circling the root ball. Girdling, the intent of the word girdling here is where as the trunk grows and the root grows, they're going to grow into each other, and that root will cut off the flow of the flow of water and nutrients from moving up and down that trunk. So that root is girdling the trunk. And that's what we want to prevent from happening, is those roots from growing bigger and cutting into the trunk as both the roots and the tree grow after you plant it. So anytime you're finding roots that are growing across the trunk, they need to go. And you want to make sharp cuts. And so that's why I have my hand pruners with me, because I want to make sharp cuts on these roots so I'm not tearing and making kind of tearing wounds on the roots that then they have to close over. So you can see here, this is a tree that's in the ground, but we haven't planted it yet. It's in its planting hole, but no soil has been added yet. And so here is a root that's crossing, that's pencil size and growing across. So imagine this tree getting bigger and this root getting bigger. Now this root's going to press into the trunk and prevent water and nutrients from moving up and down, and also prevent the roots that should be here. They'll be suppressed because this guy is pressing on them and suppressing them from growing and establishing to hold the tree in the ground. And again, this is that photo I showed when we started. We have a crossing root here. And so what you do is I just take my hand pruners and I snip on one side and I snip on the other. I snip on one side and I snip on the other. I want that guy out of there. I do not want it to continue growing. And sometimes I'll kind of pull on it a little bit to kind of see where it's coming from. But the biggest thing is I want to make sure that there's no roots that are crossing over my root ball, and especially against my trunk. So what happens if you've already planted your tree this year and you're like, Kamie, I did some things wrong? Well, that's fine. If you planted a tree this year, it can be fixed. So a couple of years ago, I was at my aunt's house for Thanksgiving, and I said, Mom, she just had all these fruit trees planted. And I said, Mom, all of these fruit trees are planted too deep. They're gonna die. And she said, you have to tell her. I was like, no, because she'll make me fix it. And my mom told me I didn't have a choice. So I told her, and then we fixed it. If you can see here, if you can kind of peer in, that's the graft point, because all fruit trees are grafted. So here's that graft point. So on I think there were 6 or 7 fruit trees. Every fruit tree we excavated to find that root flare. And you can see here how far down that root flare was from where it was actually planted. So fruit trees are, precious little creatures. They do not like to be stressed. There's so many diseases and insects that attack fruit trees that if they're stressed, they just come right in. So a buried tree is very stressed because now it's trying to grow that root system. That's one, the roots are too deep, lack of oxygen. So it's trying to grow this root system up, and then you get those crossing because they're just trying to come up to the oxygen layer, and then you get a lot of the crossing because they don't care. They're just coming for the oxygen. But a lot of these trees, my aunt's fruit trees, were over 5 inches too deep. So if you have a tree that you've planted this year, go excavate it, pull it back out, find that flare. You can just excavate as well. So if you're like, okay, it's been longer than a year, it's been a couple years since we planted, go excavate, find that root flare, pull the mulch back, pull the grass back, pull the rock back, dig down, find that root flare, and then leave it exposed. Cut off any roots that are growing across the trunk with your hand pruners or your saw, depending on how big they are, and excavate that root flare. I was in Gunnison this year, and we were looking at some crab apples that were kind of stunted, and he said they'd been in the ground for 20 years. And I was like, no way. Based on the size of that trunk, I was like, those are 20-year-old crab apple trees. Then we looked at their trunks straight into the ground, not a root flare to be seen. And I said, if you want these trees to eventually thrive or not die soon, go down and dig all that grass and soil away, find that root flare, and then just leave about a foot ring around that tree, excavated, and just put a nice low couple inches of mulch on top of that soil, so that the grass won't grow back and be next to that trunk again. So you can do something about it if you've already planted a tree. But now we'll go into like what you do if you're going to plant a tree. So the biggest part is excavating that root flare. So then you're planting that root flare at or above soil line. You'll hear that a lot, at or above. And so the reason for that is, in a lot of places, like here in Grand Junction, we have clay soil. And so when you dig in clay soil and then you plant, sometimes the tree will kind of settle, that clay soil will settle. And then what will happen is where your root flare that was at soil line is now below soil line because your clay soil settled. So if you have a clay soil, we usually say to plant 2 inches, 1 to 2 inches above soil line, so that if it settles, it'll settle at soil line. If you have sandy soils that don't compact, then just plant at soil line. But that's why we say at or above. It just depends on your soil type. So step 1, finding your root flare. It takes some time, and you'll be cursing the nursery industry, I'm afraid, but that's a whole different story. Find that root flare. Cut out any roots that are crossing, and try not to tear roots. You want to make sharp cuts. So step 2 is now determining your planting hole. So again, you don't want to dig your hole until you've established where that root flare is. So that's where the depth of your root ball, because now you've established where that flare is, and it's going to be a couple inches shorter. So the depth depends on your root flare, your trunk flare, and you can measure your root ball. I usually just turn my shovel upside down, while the tree is still in the container, turn my shovel upside down, kind of figure where my root flare is on the shovel, and then that's my depth. So it doesn't need to be exact. It's an ish. It's one of those ish words. So don't over dig. Try not to add fill to the bottom of the hole because of the settling. And if you have clay soil, you may want to plant a little high. So the size, so we talked about depth. Depth is based on where your root flare is and the depth of your root ball. So the size of your hole is saucer shaped. So we want a dish shaped hole. And ideally you want 2 to 3 times the size of your root ball diameter. So when I've been doing these planting projects at my office, everyone will be helping me, thankfully. I'm not doing this alone. And they'll ask me, is this big enough? And I'll always say, can you go a little wider? Go as wide as you can. The wider the hole, the better. And I'll show you why in a second. But dish shaped, not a hole in the ground. You want a shallow dish. So again, don't over dig. You don't want a fluffy base. You want your root ball to sit 1 to 2 inches above grade if you're in clay soil, or at grade if you're not in clay soil. So this is, again, how I like to check the depth. So you can see my coworker, Dan, that's the depth of the tree and the container where the root ball is, the depth of the root ball. And then we place a shovel across so we have an idea of the height of the depth of the hole, and then we can compare the depth of the root ball to make sure. But see how this is a nice, wide, shallow dish, and then that's the depth of the root ball. So she's measuring because it needs to be bigger, right? Most of our trees, 2 to 3 times is going to be bigger than that. But notice that it's a dish shape. So the reason why we want it saucer shaped and wider is that this saucer shape will encourage these roots to grow out. And then what happens is if you don't disturb the soil, and this is see the dots, that's indicating compacted soil or soil that hasn't been disturbed. When you have a dish that's only 2 times the size of the root ball, the roots will grow 150% the size of the root ball, but it's slower. There can be stress. But they've shown in research that if you make the dish 3 times the size of the root ball. It can grow up to 400%, and it reduces post-planting stress. I'm seeing now that growth slows, so obviously I need to fix that. So that's why I have a piece of paper next to me to remind myself on 3 times saucer remove slows growth, because the point is that the wider the wider the hole, the less the roots have to work in order to grow outwards. So if you have them in a narrower dish, those roots are hitting undisturbed soil much quicker than if you have a wider dish. They're going to be able to grow more quickly through that disturbed soil that has more air pockets before it hits that more compacted soil outside of the hole. So again, just a reminder, you have your graft point. A lot of trees have graft points. You're going to have your graft point, and then you're going to have your root flare, and your root flare is going to be at or above soil line. And then mulch can be placed above this. Mulch should never touch your trunk. If you have trees with mulch around it in your yard, as soon as we're done, you go outside, you remove that mulch from next to your trunk. That was the other tree in my friend's yard. She had, all the trees had mulch against their trunk, but one tree had been there longer. I removed the mulch from the base of the tree against the trunk, and the moisture that was being held in that mulch had started to degrade the bark of the honey locust. It was literally, the bark was sloughing off. And this has happened to me when we first kind of learned about the detriment that mulch can do against trunk bark. I lost a tree because of this, because it had degraded my bark so much that the bark sloughed off, and I basically girdled the tree by killing the bark that was around the base of the tree from having that mulch against the trunk. So soon as, make a note, going to go pull mulch away from the trunk. Sorry about that. I checked my internet speed and seemed fine before this. So where, again, it's no fun to have photos if you can't share them. So here's some photos that were shared with me about Arbor Day planting events that I was not at. And what do you see here? What are we seeing in these photos about where did they excavate the flare? Is that flare at or above soil line? I mean, this just makes me sad. I mean, clearly it's too deep. And that's what happens a lot when communities use backhoes to dig the hole, is they're always going to be too deep. But they feel like they're helping because they don't have to do the hole digging while the kids are there. But the hole is always too deep with a backhoe. I see a question that if the dish was not large enough, can I expand it? I would say the more important part of planting and looking at something and looking at a tree that's already been planted is finding that root flare and making sure that there's no girdling roots growing over that root ball and against that trunk. I wouldn't worry too much about the outside stuff. It'll grow through that. It's just you're setting the tree up for more success by making the dish larger, but make sure you can see that root flare and that there's no roots that are growing against the trunk. That's a more important part than the dish shape after you've already planted a tree. So the next step is removing the circling root. So step 1, finding the root flare. Step 2, digging your hole wide and shallow based on the depth of your root ball. And now you have to deal with the circling roots. And this just happens as trees that are grown in containers, the roots are growing out, they hit the edge of the container, and then they start circling. There are some containers out there that help reduce circling roots, but what I have found is that they just step the circling roots in. So there's like air pots. And so what happened, the point of those is that as the roots are growing, it hits the edge, and now there's holes in the pot. So when the roots hit that air, they don't continue to grow because they're hitting air, and roots can't grow in straight air. They need soil. And what I find is that they then step in to the inside of the pot and do the circling just inside of the soil. So even if you have an air pot, even if they say that these pots reduce circling roots, I don't care. You have to do these steps in order to reduce circling roots, no matter what fancy pot you have, or they say is going to be preventing the circling roots. You have to do these steps, or at least look for them. So first, you want to lay your tree on its side, so you're not just yanking the tree out of the pot, because you can do some damage to the roots if it's not super solid in that root ball. So it's best to lay the tree on its side and then pull the tree out like this. So this is me and my coworker planting a tree in her yard. She asked if I could help plant a tree, and I said only if we take photos so I can use them. So even if the container says biodegradable, nothing in Colorado is biodegradable, including burlap. Nothing's biodegradable. So everything around a root ball needs to be removed. So what happens is that if the tree has been in a container for any extended period of time, or even not extended, just any period of time, you'll start to get these woody, thicker roots growing. So this was a reputable nursery she got this tree from. It's not the nursery that you're buying the tree from. Usually it's who's they're buying the tree from. It's the producer in Oregon or Michigan, and then they're buying the tree, and then you have to fix the issues from the grower. So girdling roots are defined as roots that are a 1/4 inch or greater, kind of the size of a pencil. And so a lot of people were taught to slice the root ball. So you have your root ball and you slice into it kind of like a pie. The problem is that those roots don't stop, they don't change their direction. So when you have something where you're slicing, what happens is, if you can see my arm, the root is circling here. It's got that circle pattern from the container. When you cut into it with your sharp tool, those new roots are still in that circling pattern. They're not going to change direction. They're going to continue to grow in whatever direction they were growing in. And so the slicing doesn't change the direction of the roots. While the shaving or boxing, I usually use the word shaving, where you're shaving the edge of that root ball, that's creating new roots. Those new root tips are facing outward, facing into the soil profile that they're going to start growing in. So which root system would you prefer? I mean, obviously this is the girdling root that I've been talking about, that as this trunk grows and as these roots grow, they're going to grow into each other. So then we also don't have these nice roots that are growing out that are going to hold the tree in the ground in a windstorm. They're being suppressed by this root. So we no longer suggest slicing. We suggest shaving. Strongly suggest. And so again, this is that root tip. So when you cut a root, if you can imagine that this was circling the container here, those new roots are going to be circling still. But if this was the edge of the soil, the container, and this was a soil profile, now we're cutting this and these new roots are growing out into the soil profile. So shaving the root ball. This is when I'm, see what photos. Okay, so I see, you can see here, see here in this image, these are larger roots on the edge of this root ball. So what I do is I take a hand saw that I have specifically set aside for soil pruning. You can see there's soil on it because I don't care about keeping it super clean, but it is sharp. And so this is one of the folding saws. You can use whatever saw you want. You can use, it just has to be sharp. It needs to be something, thanks Chelsea, that you can cut through your root ball. Like, so this is actually have 2 blades that I use because it just depends on what I've remembered to put into my pruning tool bag. But what I'm doing is I'm shaving the outer inch to 1.5 inches of that root ball. So I'm crossing, using my saw, sawing back and forth. I'm basically turning a round root ball into a square or a hexagon. It depends on how many sides you make. But your point is that every side of the outer root ball needs to be shaved. So now all of these roots are going to be facing out and growing out. And when I'm cutting in with my saw, if it hits something that's really big, then I'll use my hand pruners, as you can see in the photo on the right, to snip off any larger roots. So I have my sharp cut, and those roots are going to be facing out into the soil profile. Now this feels aggressive, right? You are literally sawing the edge of the root ball off. And I do it once I have it in the planting hole. That's why this is step 3, so that all the soil and roots that you're cutting are falling into that hole. So you're not, 1, making a mess on the grass or the lawn or whatever you're planting next to. And 2, you're putting those nutrients, those roots, into that planting hole. If it's like so much that you're cutting off, then you can pull some of that out of the hole as you're planting. But that's why I like to do it once I have the root ball in the hole. So it feels aggressive, but you have seen some of the photos of what happens if you don't. If you don't shave that root ball and have fresh roots that are growing out into the soil profile, you're going to continue to have those circling roots growing, and then you're going to have potentially those roots are going to come up and cross in front of your trunk, and then you'll have girdling roots. So this is what happens if they're not addressed. This is a crabapple. And this base kind of looks like a point because a girdling root was growing across. And I didn't take a good photo, but there's actually an indentation in the trunk of where that girdling root was. And so it suppressed all the roots that should have been growing out on this side that was holding the tree in the ground. It's like scaffold permanent roots. It suppressed those because it was growing here and pressing down on the roots that were below it and suppressing them, but also growing into the trunk. And so it turned this tree's base into a point because the scaffold flare roots were not there. So if you buy a tree, I would suggest not buying a tree that has a circling root this size from the nursery. If you see this, walk to the next tree, walk away. But this was a tree purchased for an Arbor Day. And so when I arrived, I'm like, we can't plant it this way. And so what I did is I took my saw and I cut out a couple inch chunk so that it couldn't, you don't want to just cut a slice into it because roots can reconnect. So you want to take a chunk out of that girdling root. And so this was the next year. You can see that that root was not continuing to grow, and it was callousing over as it aged. So girdling roots must be addressed. So you've exposed the root flare, you've had the correct planting hole depth and width, and you've dealt with the circling roots. Those are the 3 major things that you need to do when planting a container tree. Once you have it in the ground, you've dealt with the circling roots. You want to make sure the tree is upright. And then what you can also do is form a ring of soil around the base. And that's kind of like an internal, you're packing that soil around the base of the tree. And that's an internal stake, more or less. It's helping solidify that root ball because you don't want to pack the rest of the soil around the tree root ball because you need oxygen. You need pore spaces in that soil for oxygen for the roots, but you can pack a ring right around the base and then fill the hole with soil. And that is just an extra step you can take to help with firming that root ball in the hole. So for B&B trees, I'm kind of running short on time, so I'm going to speed through this section. The most important thing is you need to remove as much of the packaging as possible without damaging the root ball. If your root ball feels like because these are really heavy, so you're basically rolling this ball to where you're going to plant it. Some people will use forklifts to move it closer if you're in a big open field. These are just really heavy trees. And so that's why, I like the container trees, even though you're dealing with those circling roots. These are just harder for people to maneuver. But you want to remove as much as the packaging as possible, but in stages. So before you get it in the hole, you want to pull back the twine. You want to find your root flare, because they can still have soil on top of that root flare. When it was dug from the field, soil can fall on top of the root ball. And so you still have to find that flare before you do your digging. But before you put it in the hole, you want to remove the bottom part of the cage with metal or wire cutters. This hole is too small, right? We talked about 2 to 3 times the size of the root ball, much too small, but these are the photos that I have. But it shows what you shouldn't do, right? So again, you don't want you can put the shallow ring around the base of these B&B trees as well, but you do want it to be on packed, firm soil, just like the container trees. And you want to remove all of the twine. No twine should be left in that hole, should be so far away the tree can't even see the twine anymore. You want to remove as much burlap as you can. Don't cut it and like stuff it into the hole. You want to use your box cutters and cut away as much of that burlap as you can, because like I said, nothing decomposes here. And then I've seen people where they just stuff it down, they like cut it off from the top and then they stuff it in the hole. But think about, once you pile soil on top of that burlap, how water is moving through the soil and then it hits this burlap, and it's this weird texture interface that doesn't allow water to move through and around the tree root ball like it should. So remove it all as much as you can, and remove as much as the wire, because the wire isn't going to decompose either. And even those, if you think about, like, if you're planting a tree that's going to get really big, like a blue spruce, those roots are huge when they're mature, and those cages have spaces, but those roots are going to get bigger. So if you can remove as much as the wire basket as you can, please do. So here's a picture of some twine that was not removed around this pine tree, and then that's what the cage looks like if you've removed it. But this was probably wholesale removed before it was put into the hole, since the base is still intact. But this is what happens. So we have a tree that's been planted. You can see that they did not remove the twine from all the way around the tree. So now what's going to girdle the tree first, the roots or the twine? Here is a conifer tree that was planted with its twine. It grew into the twine, and now it's been cast aside and is dead. This is a tree that was, the twine was removed, but none of the burlap was. And so now the roots have to try to grow through the burlap. That's just bad form. We do not want any burlap in the planting hole after we're done. Again, make sure it's upright. So now we'll quickly go through the questions that people always ask about planting. Should I add fertilizer? The answer is no. We do not want to make that planting hole so nice that when the roots hit the native soil, they're like, no. And you basically containerize the tree, because then they'll hit the edge and they'll just stay where the good stuff is. So don't over nicen your planting hole. What I say is, a lot of our soil in Colorado can be considered the Super 8. We don't want to make our planting hole the Marriott, so that those roots don't want to leave. So, and excessive fertilizer can damage the baby roots. And also you could be adding fertilizer that you already have too much of. So say you have a lot of phosphorus in your soil, then you add a 10-10-10 solution, and now you've increased your phosphorus and your tree is struggling. And you're like, but why? I added fertilizer. Well, you added the wrong kind. You added too much of something. If you are going to use something, choose slow release nitrogen. Our soils can usually use some amount of nitrogen. Amending it with organic matter, no more than 5%. That's just what we've seen. If it's more than 5%, again, you're making that hole too nice, but it also can hold a lot of water. And then as it's decomposing, it can create issues in your planting hole. So we recommend no more than 5% organic matter that you're mixing into that planting hole. You want to do your best to use site soil when refilling that planting hole. You don't want to be bringing in bags of garden soil from the garden center, because it's going to have a different texture. It's going to have some nutrients that you might not want in there. It's just best to fill it with the site soil that it's going to have to live with. You don't want to stomp or tightly pack the soil, and definitely not stomp it once you've added water. You want those oxygen pore spaces for those roots. We also don't want, like I said, we don't want any mulch on top of that root ball and touching that trunk, but we also try to keep the soil, any additional soil, off the root ball, because we made a really important, step to make sure that our root flare is above soil line. But then if we add soil on top of our root ball, then we've kind of taken away the point of having that flare at or above soil line if we're then covering it with more soil. So no soil on top of your root ball, no mulch on top of your root ball. So talking about mulch, it can be really good for your soil. Organic mulch is, derived from plant parts. It releases nutrients into the soil. Inorganic mulch, rock, stone, rubber, it has less maintenance, but it's not improving the soil. But the point is that you don't want grass growing up next to the trunk. The number of times I've seen trees that have been carefully planted with grass up to its trunk and then getting weed whacked to death is more than I should ever see, and it's frustrating. So we want some kind of barrier between the grass and the trunk so that no one is tempted to weed whack next to the trunk. The depth should be 2 to 4 inches. If any of you have been to the South, you will see, and this, I wish this photo was made up, but this is volcano mulching that is very typical in the South. When I visit Tennessee, every tree has this volcano mulch around it. And we talked about how bad mulch is for the trunk. And it just boggles my mind that it's still happening. And it's a waste of money too, because that's a lot of mulch. It is a lot of mulch around those trees. You want 2 to 4 inches of mulch, no more than that, and don't let it touch the stem or the trunk of the tree. Please make sure you water. I planted some trees at my office. I was telling Chelsea, you still continue to learn even if I've been in this field for a long time. We planted some trees at my office. We put water rings around it. I was like, yes, we did everything right. What I didn't know is that the water system didn't turn on over the weekend. We planted the tree on a Friday. It wasn't set to run till Monday, which I didn't know. I didn't even think to ask. And so this tree, I'm not sure it's going to make it, because it didn't. I went by on Sunday to check on everyone, and I was like, oh no, that tree is very unhappy. And I got water to it right away, but it went 2 days after being planted and getting those roots cut, 2 days without water. And I'm pretty sure the tree isn't going to make it. And so you have to water after you plant. Is it okay to have landscape liner? Landscape fabric, you want to cut that out and pull it away as much. We don't recommend landscape weed barrier fabric at all anymore. It is not recommended. And if you have it around any of your trees, pull it back, because it can girdle the tree. So pull that landscape liner back, cut it as much away as you can, and put mulch over that exposed root ball. How frequently should I water? Yes, this is an excellent question. I actually don't go into watering amounts in this, but we do have, I've been working with Molly Freilisher with CSU Extension here in Tri-River, and we've come up with a document to help with watering. The answer is, and that's part of this next section here, is irrigation, is that it depends. It depends on your soil type. It depends on, it really just depends. Well, it depends on the soil type. It depends on the species and the drainage and how hot it is. So when I have my watering system set up here in the spring, it's less water than in the summer. When in the heat of the summer, I'm increasing my water amount. And then winter watering is important. You want to try to water once a month if the ground isn't frozen and there's snow not on the ground. So the amount, what I like to use is a soil moisture meter. And you want to put that soil moisture meter in the root ball and then outside of the root ball to make sure that there's moisture in both. You don't want to oversaturate it. You don't want it to be wet, like dripping wet, but you don't want it to be dry where your roots are drying up. So there's a happy medium, and it just depends on your soil. I use something called a water spike that you can get from Home Depot, and you put it into the ground. I've been putting them on the four corners of my tree, and then you put your spaghetti tubing of your drip system into this water spike. They come in 14-inch deep ones, and then it fills with water and it percolates water out into that 14-inch depth. And because that's the thing with watering, with you're putting your drip emitters right at the trunk base, as that tree grows, those roots, those absorbing roots, are further away from the trunk. Not the trunk is the holding roots, right? The fine roots that are collecting the water and the nutrients, they're further out. So you want to be watering as that tree matures, the edge of the canopy. So if you think about, we call it drip line. If you think about when it's raining, what's dripping on the tree, the edge of the crown, that's where water is falling naturally. And that's where you want to be watering your trees, is the drip line or the crown edge. And so that's where I put my water stakes. And then I have my spaghetti tubing filling it, it fills it, and then it ekes out into the soil at the depth that is helpful to the tree, not just at the surface. And it also prevents the mulch from soaking all the water up and not letting the water get down to the root ball. But winter watering in Colorado, our trees, unless they're growing next to a river, are just not going to have enough water to survive. In most cases, unless it's a native desert tree, you're going to need to provide some amount of water, especially when it's hot in the summer. Staking if you're going to stake, it can only be on for one growing season. Too often we put stakes on and then forget about them, or landscapers put them on and forget about them, and then you have the girdling issues. So if you're going to use them, which they can be appropriate, where my office is on B.5 Road here in Grand Junction, it's windy as heck sometimes. And so we've had to stake our trees. But they have to be removed after one growing season, because the point of the staking is to prevent it from blowing over, but those roots need to grow. So you don't want your stake to be too tight. And this is the type of strap that you want to be using, a tree fabric strap, because there's not, you don't want any wire that's going around your trunk that could cause damage to the trunk as it moves in the wind. Tree wraps can be important for trees that have thin bark. I don't recommend tree guards, which is like those plastic guards that you put around the trunk. Just don't let grass be next to the trunk so you don't have to worry about weed whacking. Just have a mulch ring. Pruning, we'll have a whole hour-long pruning next month, but pruning at the time of planting should be done if it's corrective. So in this case, this tree has 2 leaders. And so I don't want to come back after this tree is established in 2 years and have 2 leaders still. So when we planted this tree, before we put it in the ground, we tipped it over, and I reduction pruned one of these leaders. And probably this one, you always keep the straighter, stronger leaders, the one that's more upright and has more vigor. And so I would have reduction pruned here, and so that this wouldn't be competing with this anymore. So only corrective pruning should be done at the time of planting. We won't go into tree spades. So we're there, we're done. These are just some reminders of, you want the root ball to be on undug soil. You want your saucer shaped hole to be 2 to 3 times the root ball diameter. You want the depth to have your root flare at or above soil line. And you don't want any mulch on top of your root ball. So you can see how these lines end at the edge of the root ball, so there's nothing sitting on top. So there you go. Chelsea, do we have any additional questions?
Yes, thank you so much, Kamie. This has been so helpful. I do have 2 more questions that came through, so I'll put those on the screen right now.
If the root ball isn't circling or compacted, is it still beneficial to gently loosen or break it up before planting? If you don't see any, I prefer, even if I don't see anything, if I look at my root ball and I'm not seeing any like express issues like those bigger roots on the edge, I still like to shave just the edge of that root ball, because sometimes it's hiding. Sometimes they're just inside the edge of that root ball and you don't see them on the edge. So I would still shave a little bit. So not necessarily loosening it, but I would still shave the edge of that root ball. When I have like my flowers that I get for my little, front garden here, a lot of times they're, just a mat of roots. When you get them out of the container, I tease those apart and pull that out and pull all those edges of those fine roots away so that there's nothing that could bind and circle. So just assume there's probably something there and shave the edge of that root ball. Common signs of stress in a tree after planting. So you'll see, usually it's because if it was planted too deep, so it's not getting enough oxygen, or if it's not getting enough water. And so you want to be watching your tree for the leaves, if they're kind of drooping. That's going to be your first sign that something's not quite right. Then it's probably water, is if they're kind of drooping or curling. And so you can go to Amazon, you can go to your local nursery center. A lot of places will carry those soil moisture meters. I use it for my houseplants and I use it for my trees. And so you put it in and it will say dry, wet, dry, low, high. I'm not sure what the numbers are. It's just a red, a yellow, or a green. Anyway, I would get one of those, but you don't want to just test the moisture of that root ball. You want to test the moisture outside the root ball, because those roots need to be growing into the soil profile. So you want to make sure that there's enough moisture to encourage those roots to grow out. And again, it's going to change with the season. Your spring watering is going to be different from your summer watering. Spring and fall may be very similar. And then winter watering is really helpful if you've planted a conifer or an evergreen tree. Winter watering is super important on newly planted conifers or evergreens. Oh gosh, thank you so much. How long do you leave that support stake? You should take that off right away. That is only for nursery transport. You want to remove that stake when you're planting it. I planted a tree that when I took the stake off, it basically bent over into a U shape. Since I bought it wholesale, they wouldn't let me return it. So I'm seeing how it will do. But if you paid full sale price for a tree that then droops over when you take that stake off, you're taking that baby back and saying, no, this tree is not appropriate. So yes, please take those stakes off. They are not for the homeowner's use. They're just for nurseries. Great question, Nancy.
Well, those were all of our questions, Kamie. Thank you so much. This was a great session. I really appreciate it. And thank you all for joining us.
Yes, thank you. Great questions. I appreciate the engagement.
Yeah, these are awesome. And our next session will be July 16th, same time. Learning how to prune. So
now I got to figure out how to make pruning into 1 hour. It was hard enough, obviously, to do planting in an hour. So we're going to figure this out.
We believe in you. And I think we're all engaged enough. If it's a little over, we'll be here. We're excited. So awesome. Well, we'll see you all next month. Kamie, thank you so much again.
Thank you. Have a great day.